Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. It's Monday. I have to consistently remind myself that today is Monday. So happy to see all of you. How is your week going or starting? Little head nods. All right, not the worst Monday by far, I think. All right. Happy to see you all. Thank you for joining. As you all know, this is not a required attendance thing, but I also think it's a really good time for us to talk. I'm going to go over the content from last week and this week, and whatever we don't get to, I will just continue recording and post for anybody who's not able to see or watch or join us today. But before we get into that, I just have one announcement, but I'm going to open it up to you guys as well if there are any questions. I know I put in the announcements today that I have grading lesson plans has just been taking me so much longer than I assumed it was going to take me with like other stuff. So I extended the revisions to the lesson plan due date by an extra week, I believe. It's due the day right after your spring break. I didn't want to like encroach on the spring break dates. Just to give you guys a little bit more time. That said, my goal is to get done with feedback as soon as I can. I've already started uploading some of the completed ones, so hopefully I'll be done very soon and have that out to you my goal is by Wednesday. I just wanted to give you guys a little bit more cushion time in case it was needed. And that is pretty much all I have as far as like my updates. The syllabus has been updated with just that extra little date, and so has Canvas. So that's all I have for you all regarding that. But I wanted to know if you guys had any questions or anything you wanted to go over before we get into like content for the day. You can put in the chat, feel free to unmute. I feel like I see you guys almost gonna ask and like not doing it. All right, I will leave it completely open to anybody who does have a question. Feel free at any time. But because our time is a little bit limited, I wanted to go over some of the content stuff from the last 2 weeks because I didn't have a video for you all last week. Sorry, I've been on Zoom all day. My computer's only does what it wants to. Okay, there we go. I need my chat. All right, so the topics for this week and last week were teaching students with disabilities in our modern classroom. And we'll start with kind of not basics, but like background information before we kind of get into like what kind of strategies do we know that actually work or could work or could be tried. Objective guiding questions. So the last lecture video that I had for you guys was on the different types of disabilities that there are. Per IDEA, there are 13 different disability categories. A student can be in one or multiple of those depending on their individual need. And as long as that disability has an effect on that student's ability to access education, to perform within the education system, then they are eligible for special education services. Now, once a student is eligible for special ed services, it's a gamut of like what needs to be done and required and all these different things. And they're all acronyms. I don't know why we love acronyms so much, but we really do. I think one of the most important acronyms that I'm going to share with you all, the first one was FAPE. So free appropriate public education. We went over that either in our last session or the one of the videos. Because that is like you cannot deny a student with any student really, but you should never deny a student with a disability their FAPE. The next big one to pay attention to is LRE, least restrictive environment. This is the language that comes out of the IDEA law. And the most important thing to note is that each public education agency, and you'll see this a lot in special education, public education agency, and you're like, what does that mean? It's a weird way to say school or district. It applies to both, but sometimes just one. Local education agency is one that you'll see quite a bit. That one is specific to say school when it education agency is just about district, or school applies to both. I don't know why we don't just use those specific words, but that's where it is. So IDEA requires that the district and or the school has to, how to the maximum extent possible, allow a student with a disability to be taught in their least restrictive setting, with as appropriate with students without disabilities as well. Least restrictive, meaning that if they can in some form or another be included in the general education environment, then they should be. So this is where we get into that you have some kids who are with you half the day, or the student is within your class for like the first 30 minutes and then goes to work somewhere else, or their teacher comes in, or so their teacher helps provide materials but doesn't really come into the room. This is where it gets kind of like messy, because every single student has a slightly different need, and everybody's maximum extent possible to be in a gen ed environment is different. It just really is. From the special ed side, we tend to use percentages, like what percentage of a day is a student in with their non-disabled peers or peers without disabilities. It gets messy to a point where like you don't always need to know about it. This is more of like a calculation on the special ed side of things. The thing that is most important to know is that legally, students have to be included when appropriate. And if it's appropriate, if it's found to be like, yeah, they can be in the setting for X amount of time, the whole day, every day, then they need to be in that setting. The reason for this very specific like wording in law is that in the past, and not so distant past, there was definitely a trend of this student, James, his behavior is out of control, and we're going to diagnose him as having this disability, and that means that he can just go over there. And this is a not unheard of practice for a very long time. Whether or not that student actually had that disability, whether or not that student needed supports, or that their disability just required additional supports that could be done within that original setting. Before LRE was like an official requirement, it was pretty easy to move a kid and say like, no, they should be better over there. And this is like a way to get rid of someone who is harder to teach sometimes for whatever other reasons, harder to have in a room. So this is why things like LRE are really, really important. It's to prevent any of those things from happening, from putting kids where they don't belong, but also from teaching kids in their most appropriate setting. The only reason to move a student or to decide to move a student is if they really cannot be taught in that setting appropriately. And there are definitely reasons to do that. When we look at that, like what other settings are there? We look at something called the continuum of placement services, or continuum services. So for most of you all, you will know your students within this general education environment. We also will call it an inclusion setting, a mainstream setting. The words are floating all around, just to say that the majority of the students in that classroom don't have disabilities, and this is where our specific student will be taught. Any other setting that's not gen ed is considered a specialized instructional setting. This could be a special education classroom, or resource classroom, a learning center. We have a lot of words to describe these places. Those can all happen within the same school environment. Then you have special schools and students who are taught at home, in hospitals and correctional facilities. Those are also all specialized settings. A student with a disability could have a mix of these things. This is where the percentages come in. They could have a mix of inclusion, and they could have a mix of specialized. This is where it gets to be more individualized. So if we have James who has significant behavior issues, but like the kid's a whiz at math, and he's just, his attention is all over the place and it's causing different behavior things to happen. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't be taught math in their actual environment. It's telling us that maybe part of that needs to be pulled out, but part of that could also be we're going to push in and give a lot of other types of behavior type intervention services, but they're not leaving that classroom. It just depends on what is most appropriate for this student. This is where it's not really important for you guys who are not going to be special educators to know like how the percentages break down and what your responsibilities are, because it will not come down on you so much. I think it's important for you all to understand that like gen ed is what we call inclusion now. And anything outside of that is considered specialized. So I think it's important to know some interesting things. As of 2019, I'm sorry, before I get into that, I didn't know if I've mentioned this before, but IDEA guarantees students with disabilities the right to continue receiving services and education until the end of their 21st birthday. So right before they turn 22. This is a lot of different reasons for why, but if you end up working with students who have more significant needs, you'll notice that as they get older, they may have finished their K to 12 and they go into like transition, which is just 12 plus, like continued education plus, and they may not be on any specific curriculum, and you may see them like go out into the community a lot, but they're still part of the school. This is because IDEA allows students to go in until they're 21. For students who with disabilities, they have lower graduation rates and sometimes longer graduation rates, so they don't get out in their 4 years. That extra year or two may be needed, and that's why that age limit is also increased a bit. I just put it in there because I don't remember if I told you guys that before. Okay, so when we look at where students with disabilities are taught, there are really great trends to know that students with disabilities are not all in a specialized classroom at the end of the hall in the trailer in the back of the school anymore. That is very much changed. 95% of students who receive services were in regular schools, like a traditional, normal, everyday school. They didn't have to go to a special school. They didn't have to go outside or anything like that. The other 5%, 3% of like anybody who's not, 3% of those students under IDEA were in separate schools. It's a very low population in general that goes. Sometimes that's public, sometimes it's private. In the state of California, we have the CAPCs non-public schools that many are designed just for students with autism. So this is like, if you looked at it California specific, that's probably more a lot of those youth are going. There are some other types of private schools that are specific to disability, but this could also be private schools or charter or non-public charters that are just regular schools that will have students with disabilities, and this is where they might go. Less than 1% were placed in private schools, sorry. And then less than 1% of students, like much less of 1% of students, are home or hospital bound, are in residential facilities or in correctional facilities. This is a very small number of students who fit into these categories, and they make up the rest of whomever is not accounted for. Along with those trends, some very good things. 65% of all students with disabilities are taught in their general education classroom. That is a really, really wonderful thing, because that's not how it's been. If you look at like longevity, it's really not how it's been. This is also an increase from like 2017 and 2018. So every year it's getting like a little bit more inclusive is the word we'll use. We use the percentage of 80% or more of the school day to be considered like fully inclusive, just because some students may need to be pulled out or receive services from the psychologist or go to appointments and stuff like that. That doesn't mean that they're not getting education. It just means they're getting services that might require them to be somewhere different than the regular classroom all day long. So the 80% is where it comes from. 18% of students with disabilities spend between 40 and 70% of the whole day in the gen ed classroom. So this is a slight decrease from previous years, but that also means that like would explain why students who are the 80% plus are increased, because this one is going down a little bit. And then 13% of students spend less than 40% of the day, meaning that they're spending the majority of their day in some other specialized setting. This is also a decrease from previous years, which means that we're working more towards including students with more significant disabilities in their gen ed environment, a little bit more than the year before. And that's progress can only be made like moving forward. So that's pretty cool. If you split it up by disability, if you're wondering, students who have a speech language impairment are the ones who are almost always going to be in gen ed no matter what. It's like rare. They have to have like something coupled along with it for them not to be in a gen ed environment. That speech language is so common for students, for many students, not just, it's not really like a huge determinant. Specific learning disabilities, more think of students who have like memory processing, dyslexia, dyscalculia. For the most part, they are going to be in your gen ed environment. The only exceptions would be that some schools sometimes have like a specific like math class or English class or just for students with disabilities. And that's where they'll have their whole class, even though they're on the same curriculum track and everything. And sometimes that's where they kind of separate. Visual impairment, I'm actually surprised that number is not higher because visual impairment is not a reason for somebody not to be in their gen ed environment, just they're going to need supports. Other health impairments, for the most part, that's ADD and ADHD. You're going to have them in your classroom. And then the bottom four here are actually more, what we would consider far more significant disabilities, even including developmental delays. So it's not surprising to me that those numbers are not nearly as high. The developmental delays refers to young children it's usually before they get a diagnosis of ID or intellectual disability or autism. There's a lot of like pieces of the puzzle. And I promise you, it's not that you learn all these pieces in class, is that like with time and experience, you'll learn that like, oh, that's what developmental delay means. And then that goes away. Like you just kind of learn as you go. You don't have to like memorize everything now. It's just important. It's interesting to know these things, I think, more than anything. So I've used the word inclusion a couple of times already. By like thumb up, how, or something in the chat, how often do you guys hear the words, or do you hear the word inclusion quite often in your classrooms or in your schools, in your past classes? So okay. It's not, you don't have to know everything about inclusion. So inclusion is like a new iteration of mainstreaming that was used before. And I have a little thing on mainstreaming there. Inclusion is the way of the word. It's the way education is really, really pushing. And I tell you that if you want, my advice to you, if you want like, you want to be ahead of the game in terms of special education and working with students and everything, embrace inclusion, because it's going to be the main thing coming in terms of special ed. California has taken a really, really big push towards inclusion, but also so has the rest of the country. This is just where things are going as far as like gen ed and SPED kind of coming together as a world. It's all inclusion. So there is an official definition of inclusion. Would somebody mind reading that? It's a long one. You can unmute and read if somebody wouldn't mind.
Yeah, I'll do it.
Thank you.
The National Center in Educational Restructuring and Inclusion, NCERI, in their National Study of Inclusive Education, defined inclusion as providing to all students, including those with severe disabilities, equitable opportunities to receive effective educational services, with supplementary aids to support services as needed, in age-appropriate general education classes in their neighborhood schools, toward the outcome of preparing all students for productive lives as full members of the society.
Thank you. That's a pretty good reading voice. Thank you. So there's an official definition. I actually really like the official definition. I feel like it's easy to sum up inclusion into like all kids together. without really paying attention to like why all kids together, which is what I think the definition is useful. Which this goes along very well with like one of the purposes of IDEA, which is to prepare students for life after school. And if you think of life after school, there are divisions with disabilities, but there is no what's the right word? There like with students with more mild, moderate disabilities, or sometimes we call them invisible disabilities, there is no like non K-12 way to differentiate you from the other person, or to have you be in, on the same level of someone else socially or emotionally, or just being able to kind of be around peers and knowing how to work with different people. Those things happen very naturally in a school environment. Think of like you set kids up in a group today, in a small working center, and this one doesn't like that one. And this is all normal people stuff. You learn how to deal with people while you're children. You do it with your peers all the time. It's funny to see kids figure it out because you see it as an adult. And these are all really important skills. Having a little boyfriend or girlfriend, and then having the other one be jealous, and how you like deal with these things as kids, and learning how to come up with that stuff. All really important socially. And they lead to good relationships, and they lead to knowing how to get what you want and find those things you need in life. It's all wonderful. Individuals with disabilities don't do very well in any of these like social or like human interaction stuff as a whole. Not that they can't, they definitely can. Just as a whole, because if we teach them separate, then they only have a very specific like perception and outcome, and they're not really getting a lot of that social stuff that's happening and that needs to happen, that should be done, because they're not participating with the rest of the students or their peers.
Hey,
That,
Bilkis.
oh yes.
I just really like that last part of that sentence. Mm-hmm. And that really should be towards all students, whether they're included in the special ed mantra or not. That should be the goal of every single teacher out there, is that your job not only is to teach content, but the more important job is to teach and prepare productive students of society. And students need to know that's part of their major goal of school, no matter what program they're in.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. I 100% agree. So my area in special ed is called transition, where like it's my specialty, but where we help students move from school to life after school. And I find it to just be like fascinating and incredibly interesting. But we get caught up in it a lot as teachers, especially if you're working with little ones or younger students. Students have a really hard time understanding, even when they're at the very end of their school, that they are not going to be in school forever, that there is a world in which they will spend the majority of their lives not in school. If you think about it, like say they don't go to college or a post-secondary ed and they finish after high school. That means from age like 18, 19, all the way to the end of their lives, they're not in school anymore. And it's very hard for them to like understand these things while they're young, because this is the only world they know so far is school. And this is the only world that they can really imagine for the most part is school. And it's really, I think it comes up to like the adults in the building to prepare students for life after school as like actual people in the world. But we get caught up in it too, because we have state standards to meet and we have a bunch of things to teach. And along with that, they also have to be like decent humans that we take part in. And like all of it, I think is incredibly important. There's so many factors to consider. But when we are looking at a topic of inclusion and preparing future people to be people, we are not doing this very effectively in terms of like the social stuff, the experiences. You can tell that we're not doing it effectively just when we look at outcomes of students or individuals with disabilities. After they leave the school world, they're Some have difficulties in employment. Some have difficulties getting and finishing secondary or post-secondary education. For individuals with way more significant disabilities, they did this really big study where they asked people like 3 years out of graduation from high school, what do you miss the most? And the thing that they missed the most was friends, because nobody taught them in school how to make friends outside of school. And the only friends that they knew they had were the same kids that were in that classroom with them for those 4 years. They didn't have any of those outside friends from the rest of the school, friends from baseball team, from after school club. They didn't do those things very well because they weren't given those same experiences through the inclusion world. Okay, so you may come to hear the word mainstreaming. It's an inclusion. They are very close to being very similar. But like I said, we are really moving towards inclusion, and for a couple of reasons. So the main reason actually is that mainstreaming is like full integration. Is that the right word? Full integration. Like when you think of somebody learning a new language and they just go straight into the supermarket without knowing anything and trying to find their way around. I forget what the exact terminology for it is. And they're eventually they'll figure it out. And if they keep going, they'll figure it out. They'll learn how to do the thing. It'll not be easy, but that's a lot of what mainstreaming is. Get in there, you're doing it. We're not really making many adjustments for you. If you have services, we'll send you to go get your services. That is a lot of mainstreaming, and a lot of those things the student is mainly taught, and those services are mainly provided by the special educator, when not in the gen ed classroom. Inclusion is different because it focuses on collaboration more than anything. And the student is mostly taught by the gen ed teacher, and those services are, when possible, put into the classroom so that the student doesn't have to leave that setting to go get them or to receive the needs. This is it's a slight change from one to the other. I think the reason for inclusion is partly monetarily, to be honest. I don't know, I'm pro inclusion, but I don't know really what marked a shift from one to the other than we want students to be in their room as much as possible, or with their peers as much as possible. But just to show you that. Okay. I pulled out some common arguments on what special educators hear pretty often of anti-inclusion. They don't from other people that the inclusion is not a good idea. Because we are beholden to the law. I'm just going to tell you that those assumptions or those arguments are just technically wrong. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter when there's a law that has a multiple safeguards, so that your opinion on this thing doesn't really count because there's a legal precedence to do something. But before I say this, I will also just make a note. It's not that your opinion doesn't count. Your opinions always count. It's that as a teacher, you don't get a choice about which kids to teach. It doesn't matter what I feel about gay rights or homelessness or disabilities in a classroom. My feelings are moot because my students are still going to be there, and some of them may be experiencing any of these things, regardless of what my opinion is. My duty as a teacher is to teach the students and to provide them the thing that is required to provide them to help them be successful, regardless of what I feel. I could feel those feelings any other time of the day, but it should never come down on those students. So first one, students with disabilities take too much time away from their non-disabled peers. The other argument is I don't have time to teach this student because they have too many needs. To that, the general response is that special education is not the same thing as different education. You're not teaching something different. You're teaching something differently. You're teaching something with additional supports, with additional resources and materials. It doesn't mean that you're teaching something entirely different. You should not be teaching something entirely different. That's called two preps. Like you can't do that at the same time. It is, it does take time. It's not that it doesn't take time. If the student requires one-on-one support, then it needs to be put in, but maybe it could be put in a different way, a slightly interesting way, like a way for them to, access that support without having to take all of your time. It requires critical thinking and problem solving skills, definitely. And it doesn't mean that we all have the time to put all those skills to use, but it also means that we don't get to get away from them either. And I will also say differentiated instruction already exists. We do it all the time. You may have heard or been taught you have like 3 levels of students in a classroom. You have your students who are like high, they're getting everything, they're way too fast. And if you don't have something for them prepared next, they're going to be like your disruptive kids because they're getting it too fast. Not too fast, just faster. You have your kids in the middle who are following at the pace that you expect and that you like plan for the most part. And then you have your kids at the bottom who require just additional support with or without disabilities. For like what we hear a lot is that teachers teach to the top and they teach to the bottom, and the kids in the middle tend to get a little bit forgotten, which is true. But you are already doing this work and like trying to solve those problems, right? Like I got to make sure that this one's okay and that one's okay and this one's always ahead of the game, and then he starts talking to this guy and this guy never finishes his work. Like it turns into all of this. You are already doing all of this differentiated instruction. It may be an additional note to it, but you're there. Problem number 2, a safe classroom environment with fewer distractions provides better services for students with significant disabilities. It's not wrong, but it's a little bit of what I said before of a self-contained classroom will only deliver self-contained outcomes. You can't teach, you just can't teach certain things in a classroom of 3 people who all have the same perception and idea. You have to do some of these things. You have to do some of these interactions with everyone, with different people, with different ability levels. You're only going to get certain outcomes. If you like to think like more societal and big, students with significant disabilities are, for many reasons, completely capable of work. And there's different kinds of work programs, but they can be completely capable of like traditional work settings. It just time and training. But if we don't do some of that stuff while they are in school, then it's hard for them to get it when they're not in school. And now you've just created, or not you, but like now the system has created another individual who is very dependent on government services. And those government services are meant to be there for these individuals. It's not that they don't suit this need, but this need could also be done somewhere. Like it doesn't have to be, we could do it differently. If we teach some of these things differently from the beginning, if we attack the problem very early instead of like way late, we create much less dependency on like the need for outside resources and services when we give students the abilities to do these things and trainings and support ahead of time. There is a post-secondary education program. It's called Think College. It's across the entire country. It's really wonderful. I also work for them slightly, so it's me being very biased. But the number of studies that we have done have shown that like if you do some of these things ahead of time, individuals with significant disabilities are not dependent on any kind of assistance type program, because they are able to be a part of community and education and employment, and they like all of these services, the regular human people stuff, creates less like societal dependence on government agencies. It's very interesting. We can take a part of that. Okay. Students with disabilities won't get anything out of being in general ed. One of the studies from Dupois, I believe is the author's last name, or one of the articles I had assigned for this past 2 weeks, did a dual survey, and they surveyed students with disabilities who are in gen ed, and they surveyed gen ed students who are in classes with students with disabilities. And they asked them, just a bunch of students, what do you think? Students with disabilities, generally highly motivated to be in a gen ed classroom, high and low disabilities, like high needs, low needs. They feel fulfilled, they feel more challenged, they're more successful and like feel included academically and socially. And they've reported that it helps increase their own motivation to like learn and do better if the rest of the class is also learning and doing better. Really great social outcomes. Students without disabilities are they report being happier and like more positive about like who's in the class and who's learning, like what is happening here, when they are aware that they are in an inclusive setting. And this gets a little sticky, and it was mentioned in the article of like, we shouldn't be pointing out and saying like, James has a disability, he's in our class today. Like that's not at all what we should ever do. But if there's an opportunity to say, this is a class of like mixed abilities, we have students who are geniuses as this one thing, we have students who are still learning to become those geniuses, like everybody is at a different stage, and like acknowledging and awareness of different levels and abilities, and creating that classroom that is inclusive and has an inclusive culture in that classroom where your current level is accepted because everybody will continue to move on levels. That kind of idea helps the gen ed students really become aware of what is happening in the classroom, but also benefit from that same thing. You may also hear arguments about students' performance in these classrooms. For students with disabilities, performance is it's important. We look at it and we know that it being in an inclusion setting produces positive performance in terms of like academic skills or tests and things like that. They still need all like whatever additional supports they need to learn, but they do get good outcomes of it. You may often come across the argument of like, this is going to put all my other gen ed students behind if we're teaching to the low all the time. There is no proof, no study that says that having individuals with disabilities, high or low, has any kind of negative impact on non-disabled students. That's not the word I like. Students without disabilities, academic performance either. There's nothing to say that. This is more of a perception than anything else. It will not impact the student. Oh, okay. This is a little bit of what I said before. Gen ed teachers didn't sign up to work with students with disabilities. This is something that was said to one of my special ed teachers a week ago. They didn't sign up for this. They don't know how to do this, which is a whole other thing. And they are not going to do this. This is like a very difficult conversation. I have had this conversation multiple times with gen ed teachers. This is one that people have every day still today. As I mentioned before, you don't get a choice of who gets to be in your classroom and who doesn't. If we did, I would 100% kick out every kid who ever gave me behavior issues because I suck at dealing with behavior, right? Like if I could just deal with like, let's only learn content and let's love learning content, then I'd have like 5 kids in my class. That's not how it works. We just don't get to choose things like that. The kid that's in your room is the kid that's in your room, and you're responsible for teaching them regardless of what the situation is. Disruptive behaviors by students with disabilities might cause distractions to others. Yeah. Do none of your other students cause disruption? This is only specific, only the kids with disabilities have any disruptive behavior. No other kid causes disruption. Like that is the other argument. If you don't know how to deal with behavior, just say it. Like I would say, I don't know how to deal with behavior, then that's something we need to learn how to do. You can't blame all disruption on students with disabilities. It's just silly. All right. Those are my takes on inclusion. I have a couple of, not many, I think I have like 4 different strategies, and you might have come across them already. If depending on the grade level you work with, you totally know them already. Co-teaching is not a specific strategy I want to teach you all on, mainly because I know you're getting taught co-teaching like multiple other ways. I put it here so that it is here. The thing that I wanted to emphasize a little bit on co-teaching, and I don't know if you guys do this. This is something I had to, my first co-teacher had to teach me. what is your expertise? Like, what do you bring to this table? And let's capitalize on your best. Like, this is what you're very good at, instead of I'm going to tell you what you're going to do type of co-teaching model. So I had a gen ed teacher, like my very first year teaching, and I was like, okay, I'm apparently your co-teacher. And I was like totally cool with if you're familiar with the models, like the one teach, one observe. Like I just wanted to like hide in the back. I was so terrified of everything that was happening there. I was like, you teach and I can like go and help. And she's like, is that what you're good at? Like just random helping? And I had not considered before, like, what exactly am I very good at that's going to support this classroom and like my students in this classroom, but also if I'm here, what are the other kids going to get out of this? We had to like, she taught me a bunch, actually. I loved it. Her expertise is in the content that she taught. I believe it was English. And my expertise is I can break things down into small pieces. I can help like make things very logical, which for lots of students is really helpful. Like a big chunk of instructions is not useful to all kids. Here's what we do, and here's what you need to do first. I'm like very good at like ordering and adapting things to like just make a little bit more sense. And so we started doing that. I'd get all the curriculum, and then and I would help adapt some of those things, and we just make it available for all kids. But I knew who I was making these things for, and I knew that it would help them. The adage of like, if it helps a student with disability, it'll help everyone else is very much true. Like if it works for this kid, it's going to work for like 10 more kids. And so I think the most successful co-teaching partnerships are not necessarily ones that like use one method over the other or whatever. I tend to think it's like when you utilize your best strength and then you capitalize on that. And then the other person will do the same together. You're talking like great strengths, and we can figure out where those gaps are and work on them like as needed or as they come up. But I think the other, I don't know how much experience you'll have had on co-teaching just yet, but the other side of that for me has been like, this is my classroom and you only help your kids. And like, it's not an unheard of model. It's just not a great one either. That doesn't do anything for anybody. So when it works, when co-teaching does work, you get higher rates of student participation, higher rates of student performance. You have 2 qualified people in this classroom teaching one thing. You should get twice the better results, really. Students are also display less behavior related issues, because again, there are 2 adults or 2+ adults in this classroom. More can be attacked, more can be done. You can give more students feedback. You can make sure that everyone is actually on task and not just the highs and the lows. When it doesn't work, and this is the model that some of us may be more familiar with, when co-teaching does not work, it is a giant disaster start to finish. It doesn't like get better magically. When co-teaching doesn't work, it just, I think it creates, I wrote it here, mine versus your mentality. Like, this is my classroom and this is what I'm in charge of, and those are your things and your students, and that's what you're in charge of. And if that really is the case, then you might as well just be in 2 different classrooms. Because this does not create a cohesive learning environment for anybody in there, not the teachers, not the students. Which article was this from? I forget which article, but they say that when co-teaching does not work, it is because the teachers in that room rely really heavily on that like one teach, one assist type model, and like don't mix it up or don't include any other models. It's just always like, I'm over here and you're in the back of the room with your 3 kids. Like that's not an effective model for anything. You got to mix it up. There are some guided planning things for co-teachers, which I actually did like, but it has this decision-making flow chart, which like, I don't know if you guys have ever done with your other classes or teachers, like which model should we actually be using? This is a pretty cool little flow chart that helps you figure out like, oh, for this exact thing, this model might actually be a little bit better than the other one. And we'll try it slightly different this time around. We'll see how it goes and we'll fix it next time. Okay, actual things. Has anybody come across or heard of or used a task analysis in the past? Alex, I see Heather. Okay. If you have not, I will tell you a task analysis is my favorite thing in the world. I use them for myself every day. I use them to give instructions to people all the time. A task analysis is a sequence list of steps that make up a whole task. It's different than a checklist because checklists can be done in any order. You don't have to do a checklist in a specific order. When you do a task analysis, you need things to be done in a very specific order. And when they are, then that task has been completed. It's logical. We call them discrete skills, like things you can do, things that are actions, and not so much like, well, I guess you could do a task analysis for like emotions, but it's not really what we use them for. They're like my favorite thing in the whole world. They work for absolutely anybody. They got really big in education through the autism community because order and schedules and like processes are very useful for many individuals with autism. Just in general, like they function really well with routine when they know what's coming up, when they know what to expect next and in the next hour and tomorrow. But you can also say, who doesn't function better when they know all those things? If you know all these things are coming, then you can plan for them. So a task analysis can be made visually. They can be like scripts that a student will use, like speaking or writing task analysis. They can just be steps to solving a problem, for comprehension, for behavior. You can use them to make students monitor their own like skills and growth and behavior, which is one of my favorite things. I put here 2 different kinds, and they're both very simple. You can make one for solving math problems. Say you're doing, I don't know what this is, something to do with a graphing calculator. List all the steps. Every single step is a thing that the person needs to do. When you did step 1, now you can go into step 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. And when you got all your 10 steps, you have done this task. Now do it again with the next problem and do it again with the third problem. And eventually, maybe that task list will be needed. Maybe you can cut down some of these tasks to be 5 steps. And like you can start chunking some of these things. This is like a killer way to have somebody learn how to do something completely new and foreign, any new task. You can make them, people love a visual task. This is like to get the mailbox, add some pictures, write the steps down. Teachers of students with disabilities for very self-help type skills like brushing your teeth or tying your shoes. These are very common ones. You can use pictures, like take a picture of the actual like environment for that individual, make it into a step. This is literally what it looks like, and this is your first step. But you can make these very complicated. You can make these very easy. There are also many available online. When I just Googled like images for reading comprehension, for writing papers, for like everything. When you are teaching a new skill, when you need students to do something in a very specific manner, give them a task analysis. You will like give yourself a task analysis for the thing you got to do tomorrow. You will find it so useful. All right, in your inclusion environment, you're the only teacher, only adult in this room. And how on earth are you going to do all these things in the middle of class to help all of your students, and very specifically to make sure that you're helping your students with disabilities? Depending on the content of your class, you can use some peer assisted learning strategies. I put my 2 favorite ones, but the tippy top one is my absolute favorite. Class-wide peer tutoring. I think I mentioned a version of this before, the 3 before me rule. Did I tell you guys this? So I worked with a really great math teacher. I believe it was 9th grade math. And he had students in groups of 4 in his classroom. He would do his lecture and he would teach everybody, and they would practice as a whole class. And then when it was time to do class work, he was finding that students were raising their hands like every minute, like, I need your help, I need your help, I need your help. Like they weren't attempting many things on their own. And so he installed a rule that said 3 before me. You have to ask 3 people, how to do something before you can ask me how to do it. And if the three people can't really help you, if they're in a group of four, it should be your whole table. If nobody here can get you, then I will come and I will help you and we'll figure this thing out together. And that is a portion of class-wide peer tutoring. If your student doesn't fully get it, but they're in a group or they're sitting next to somebody who can support them, and this is like part of the rules of your classroom, then they can help one another. You can make it an actual activity where, let's say you have two groups of students, and this group of students is learning how to do steps 1 through 5, and this group of students is learning how to do steps 6 through 7. When you put them together, you mix everybody up. Emily, who had 1 through 5, is going to go teach James, who had 6 through 7. Once he teaches it, he can tell her back again how to do it. She can answer any questions, and then they switch. He teaches 6 through 7. She tells them back, just like they're taking the role of like a mini teacher in this stage. And they are tutoring one another on how to do something. You're controlling what it is what they're tutoring each other on. And you're controlling kind of the rules of this whole situation, which if you wanted to know, how do I teach them these rules? Give them a task analysis. You set these things up really well. This could become, depending on the content and what you teach, this could be a really great thing to do in your classroom at different times. This is a really good way to also make sure that everybody is engaged and doing something while you are like running around is probably the best word because everybody's always running around trying to support what is happening in that classroom. The other one was collaborative strategic reading. I have a link for this because it's a little bit more. I'm not going to actually explain all of these things. In the chat, there's a link, but also in the PowerPoint and the notes under the slide, there's a link for both of these things. The collaborative strategic reading it's not difficult to do in any sense. I just feel like you should probably read what those 4 steps are, and they're better described in the Edutopia article than I would describe it for you. But I mean, just good general strategies in general. I included in this very last 2 slides here, I included universal design for learning. And I will tell you that I have a little chip on my shoulder for UDL. I think it's great. It makes a bunch of sense. This has been a very common practice in special education for a long time. It's like rebranded and given to gen ed teachers and be like, look at this new thing we just learned. This has been a huge practice in special ed for a really long time. It's a lesson planning strategy essentially that makes you look at how do you represent material in more than one way. So you're not just doing the lecture thing. How do you engage students in more than one way? It's not just like, does anybody have any questions? Or you only have one question that you ask them. They have to express their ability, their knowledge, and they have to express their questions and their learning in very different manners, more than the one way. Multiple means of engagement. How do you have students actually work with the material more than one way? This is the same thing as differentiated instruction that I said you guys are likely already doing. An example of like multiple means of engagement. I had a student who had, he was like borderline ID, very low reading, and they're in inclusion class. And I believe they were reading Othello in that class. We found comic strips with Othello and a lot of the same language, but also kind of simplified language. This was like a really great way for the student to engage the material because they were still in class listening to the story. They watched the movie. I think they saw a play. Like they did like 5 different ways to engage with this material, and he got a comic strip on top of it, and like all together understood what was happening, understood what was needed, and engaged with all of this stuff in a very different way. It's all of this stuff just requires planning, which I know is the hard part. I really do know is the hard part. Yeah, you just gotta like set up some routines. And if you wonder, how do I set up routines? Make a task analysis. It's just honestly great. Like you gotta try it. My homework to you all have a freebie this week. I don't have any work assigned for you. Pick a task that you already don't like to do. Break it down into all its pieces. Make a task analysis. and like follow that to do it. Take note, like, does it feel good? Like it's going faster? Does it feel like you actually did it and like you're getting it done, as opposed to this is a pain and I hate doing this and I'm not going to finish it anyways? Make a task analysis. It's super helpful. They use it a lot in applied behavior analysis research, ABA research, which is heavy on behavior. To teach skills, it has been proven to be causational. Yeah, it has been proven to be a causational effect of improved skills. It has, there was one other thing, improved skills, improved behaviors, and it's causational. Yep, no, task analysis, way to go. Very simple, promise you it's simple. Okay, that is inclusion boiled down really fast. I am going to leave this completely open to you all. I know we only have a couple minutes left, but you are welcome to stick around if you have any questions. I just feel free. Oh, also, if you don't have any questions, go enjoy the rest of your Monday. Thank you for joining me. I really appreciate you guys hanging out with me on Monday.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too.
Thank you.
Thanks, Professor. Have a good night.
Thank you. Bye, Alex.